Secretary David Lammy.
Well, with permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on Jonathan Hall KC's independent review of separation centres and the government's response to it. On the 12th of April 2025, convicted terrorist Hashim Abedi brutally attacked 3 prison officers in the separation centre at HMP Frankland. I've seen the CCTV footage of what happened, Mr. Speaker, and it's truly horrifying. And I want to pay tribute to the officers, who I know will continue to be deeply affected by the appalling attack that they suffered simply for doing their jobs and keeping all of us safe. As the House will know, separation centres are specialist, high-secure units within prisons containing the most pernicious, extremist and terrorist offenders, determined to spread hate and inspire violence. And extremism in the prison estate takes, of course, many forms. But to date, these units have only been used to contain Islamic extremists, and they protect other prisoners, staff and the public. Before responding to Jonathan Hall's review, I visited HMP Frankland Separation Centre. I met the brave officers who serve there, dedicated professionals doing an incredible and essential job. A public service carried out far from the public view. And as the Abedi attack made devastatingly clear, extremism and violence in our prisons are real, present threats, and they must be dealt with decisively for the safety of the British public, and that is why the government appointed Jonathan Hall KC to lead an independent review into separation centres to learn lessons, strengthen our defences and reduce the risk of such an attack happening again. Madam Deputy Speaker, following this incident, the government acted immediately to strengthen protections for frontline staff. One of my first acts as Deputy Prime Minister was to invest £15 million in prison security, increasing the number of stab-proof vests available for frontline officers from 750 to 10,000, with 5,000 specifically for officers working in long-term and high-security prisons, as well as providing training for up to 500 staff in the use of tasers. I believe the members opposite welcomed these moves, but couldn't explain why they had never done so themselves when they were in government. Staff also have access to a range of protective equipment, helmets, arm and leg protection, gloves, batons and shields, as well as body-worn cameras and Parva pepper spray, all to help them keep safe. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government is grateful for Mr Hall for his forensic and thorough work. His findings are clear. The core principle behind separation centres remains sound. Small, specialist units are crucial for managing the most dangerous and influential offenders, not just because of the violent nature of the offending, but also the risk of radicalisation they pose to other prisoners. They must be kept away from the general prison population, but the system must improve. The report makes 13 recommendations to strengthen safety, sharpen accountability and modernise how separation centres operate. The government accepts all 13 in full and in some areas will go further. Full details are in today's government's response, but I will now set out the key themes. The first focuses on managing risks. When it comes to staff safety, Mr Hall finds that the most dangerous offenders actively seek out weaknesses to exploit, and the underlying risk posed by certain terrorist prisoners can never be entirely removed. The government is clear that prison staff must be properly equipped to spot those risks and tackle them. Alongside our immediate protective measures, we will continue to invest in tools, training, the support staff need to manage terrorist risks safely and confidently, and including a comprehensive expert-led review of the training for separation centre staff, ensuring it's tailored to the uniquely dangerous environments in which they work. Madam Deputy Speaker, the second theme addresses how separation centres work in practice and how they are led. Mr Hall identifies a clear need to transform the way separation centres are governed and operated. That is why we will explore all available options to overhaul the system, including at the next spending review the creation of new, tougher, Supermax-style units for the most violent, disruptive prisoners. This will be a tiered system with movement between tiers only permitted following rigorous new risk assessments. And we will begin designing this system immediately. We will also improve the quality of referrals into separation centres through a single specialist team with expertise to produce high-quality, defensible referrals. The third theme focuses on reform of current policy and law. Mr Hall finds that outdated procedures and legally complexity constrain operational flexibility. They undermine prison officers' professional judgment and they expose the system to unnecessary litigation. Members opposite should pause to consider that they did nothing to fix this mess to support frontline staff to do their job with certainty, and this government is clear that process and policy must support effective risk management, not obstruct it. We have already improved the defensibility of our separation centre policy framework, and we will go further to ensure it's robust and grounded in operational reality. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government remains committed to the European Convention of Human Rights, but commitment does not mean complacency. We recognise the challenges of Article 8, composed for separation centre decision-making, as highlighted by Mr Hall, and the impact that litigation has on the ability to manage terrorists and other dangerous offenders. Again, unlike the party opposite, we think that this is wholly unacceptable, and that is why we are strengthening internal processes so they are clear and resilient to challenge, allowing staff to focus on managing risks and protecting the public. We will also consider whether new legislation is needed to protect decisions taken by experienced staff in separation centres from litigation on Article 8 grounds, exploring the full range of options to deliver this. While being clear, we will remain compliant with our obligations under the ECHR. The fourth theme focuses on intelligence. Mr Hall finds the current intelligence practices are too bureaucratic and insufficiently focused. The Government has already improved how intelligence is used across the prison estate. The new counter-terrorism training package launched last year supports staff to identify and act on terrorist risk behaviour. It's another example of how this Government supports frontline workers in the way that they were not supported previously, and we will go further, improving collection practices so that higher quality and more relevant intelligence is gathered, and this will be supported by further training of specialist staff, working with the security service, of course, to ensure that the most serious risks are managed using the full range of available tools, and high-quality intelligence directly informs operational decisions. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, the attack on HMP Franklin was a stark reminder of the dangerous prison staff face every day. Our response will be decisive and determined. We will strengthen security, better protect staff, reinforce the resilience of our counter-terrorism infrastructure. We cannot accept the situation we inherited, with frontline staff dealing with the most dangerous offenders having to second-guess their actions. This Government will always stand behind those who stand between the public and danger. We will not shy away from reform in this area. We will never lose sight of our first duty, and that is to keep the British public safe. I commend this statement to the House.
Before I call the opposition spokesperson and other members, I would just like to note that the Hashim Abedi case, to which passing reference was made, the Hashim Abedi case is sub judice. Members should avoid reference to the specifics of such cases. And I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Justice Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and I welcome the publication of this important review. The Government commissioned Jonathan Hall to produce his report following the very violent attack on 3 prison officers by Hashim Abedi. He was the man behind the Manchester Arena atrocity last April, and I want to pay tribute to the vital work done by the brave men and women of the prison service. We should be frank about why separation centres are needed. They house the most dangerous and radicalised terrorist offenders in the country. As Charlie Taylor wrote in 2022 after inspecting these centres, they were designed to be used for prisoners from any political or religious viewpoint, but so far they've only been used for Muslim men. That should not be a surprise, because Islamist extremism is by far the gravest threat we face, and attempts to pretend otherwise are not only cowardly but enormously counterproductive. MI5 says 75% of its counter-terrorism work is focused on Islamists. 61% of terrorist prisoners are Islamists. Yet the figures show only 10% of prevent referrals are Islamists. Even today, and I know the Justice Secretary was clear about the Islamist threat, even then he had to caveat his comments by saying extremism in the prison estate takes many forms. Of course it does, but time after time we hear people in positions of authority refer to acts of terrorism, anti-Semitic violence, and the poison of intolerance and hatred without the bravery or honesty to name the ideology behind it all. Its name is Islamism, and it has no place in our country. But if we're afraid to be honest about it, we will never defeat it. In prisons, Mr. Hall has previously said that the impact of Islamist groups has been underappreciated for too long by the authorities. He's reported that Islamist gangs in prisons are too often viewed through the lens of good order and discipline, with governors believing they can sometimes provide a degree of calm and stability. He's revealed that prison officers sometimes appeal to the wing emir for their assistance in maintaining good order. So when will prison inspectors be directed to investigate Islamist extremism? Will the Justice Secretary ensure known problems like gang-enforced Sharia courts in prisons are investigated and reported upon? Will he publish information on the number of religiously and ideologically motivated incidents in prison? The problems for prisons caused by our human rights laws are well documented, and the Justice Secretary said he would, quote, consider if new laws are needed to limit litigation based on Article 8 of the European Convention. Making full use of the Sir Humphrey lexicon, he said he was exploring the full range of options, but promised nothing concrete and is obligatory in this government of human rights lawyers pledged fealty to the European Convention. But consider the recent case of Sohaib Abu, an ISIS terrorist serving a life sentence who plans to shoot up a crowd, in his words, of civilians. He was held in a separation centre and made subject to greater restrictions following the Abaidi attack. He used Article 3 of the Convention, not mentioned by the Justice Secretary, to argue successfully that his prison, Wood Hill, didn't take into account his mental health. So can the Justice Secretary tell us how many prisoners are in the process of suing the government under the prison rules and the European Convention to escape separation centres and close supervision centres? What is he doing to prevent them being awarded compensation? When will he decide if he needs to legislate to try to limit the application of Article 8? And what is he going to do about Article 3 claims like the one made by Sohaib Abu? And shouldn't the Justice Secretary be open about the reality of his commitment, repeated today, to the ECHR? It means rights for criminals and terrorists like Sohaib Abu and Hashim Abaidi, but danger for prison officers and the wider public. The Justice Secretary can say what he likes about perhaps after careful consideration and in the fullness of time, legislating on Article 8. But the simple truth is, as long as we remain in the ECHR, he can't guarantee a thing, and that is why we must leave.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the Shadow Justice Secretary on the dangerous, radicalised offenders that we are talking about, and I sensed some cross-party agreement on that and the importance of the work that is being done here. He rightly talks about Islamic extremism in our prisons being the main context here, and I would agree with him. 254 prisoners in custody for terrorism and terrorism-connected offences in England and Wales, looking at the latest figures. 60% of those held have an Islamic ideology, 30% held have an extreme right-wing ideology, and 10% were categorised as holding other ideologies. And he's right that in these separation centres, as I conveyed, we are dealing with Islamic extremism, and it's pernicious and it's challenging. He talks about gangs. Most prisons show no evidence of extremism based on gang activity. Where it does exist, we have got a zero tolerance and encourage staff to clamp down on it swiftly with any threatening behaviour. Jonathan Hall talks about the important training that is necessary in this area, and that is why we'll be investing in training counter-terrorism specialists and intelligence officers to identify and disrupt gang activity particularly. And our internal assessment, because he talks also of the previous work that was done in this area, our internal assessment is that 208 out of 230 recommendations have been completed when we look at the entirety of other reviews that have looked at counter-terrorism in prison, and some of them he will have commissioned in his time in the Home Office. Only 7 of those recommendations rejected, 15 remain open. All of the open recommendations are from more recent reviews and are being actively worked on. Some of them require legislative changes. Look, we recognise, of course, the use of Article 8 and Article 3 in relation to this group of prisoners, but we are absolutely clear that talk about leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, in the end, a convention that was championed by Winston Churchill, would leave children, the elderly, and many vulnerable victims like those of John Worldboy, the 97 killed in the Hillsborough disaster, British troops who died in Iraq, in the most vulnerable of positions. So we cannot and must not do that. So first, we're looking closely at the guidance, as I indicated, and 2, we will explore legislative obligations. That's the sensitive and detailed work that we must do, because we do it within our existing obligations to the ECHR. Thank you, Madam President.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by paying tribute to those officers who suffered an appalling assault simply for doing their job. They and their loved ones will continue to feel the effects of that day for years to come. They deserve not only our thanks, but the assurance that everything possible is being done to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. And that attack exposed serious weaknesses in how separation centres are run and made clear the need for urgent change. The Liberal Democrats therefore welcome the independent review conducted by Jonathan Hall KC and the work he has done to examine how these centres operate and what steps are needed to strengthen safety and security so that something like this never happens again. Getting separation centres right is crucial for the integrity of our prison system and for the staff who should never have to put their health or lives at risk simply to do their job. These facilities must be fit for purpose and capable of securely managing the most dangerous extremists and terrorists. The Ministry of Justice has been left firefighting crisis after crisis, and if we are serious about restoring confidence in the justice system, we cannot afford complacency, especially when dealing with the most dangerous offenders. It is right that the government is taking action, and I would ask the Secretary of State today to set out a clear timeline for the implementation of those 13 recommendations and when the House will receive an update on the progress. And will he commit to a follow-up report to assess whether these changes have genuinely improved safety and effectiveness? And a recent Chief Inspectorate of Prisons report on separation centres found that staff support and mandatory training were applied really inconsistently across the prison estate. At one site, almost half of officers said insufficient attention had been paid to their mental health, and at both centres, more than a third said they needed additional training to feel confident in their role. So will the Secretary of State update the House on whether conditions have improved since that report, and if not, what concrete steps is he taking to address those gaps in training?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and we continue, of course, to place individuals in separation centres. We'll do that, and Mr Hall's review confirmed that they do remain a vital part of our strategy to manage the most significant terrorist risks in our prisons, and I'm pleased that there is cross-party support in relation to that. She asked if I would update the House on the progress as we move to implement Jonathan Hall's review, and I will seek to find ways to update the House as we move through that. But I have indicated that some of those recommendations will have some bearing on the next spending review and indeed on legislative timeframes, so I suspect they will go beyond this particular Parliament. She's also quite rightly mentioned the mental health of the officers involved, and what, you know, to be attacked in the way that we saw does involve tremendous trauma for those officers. officers who are putting their lives at risk on a day-to-day basis, not just the officers but their families, but those who remain to deal with the aftermath of those attacks, the other officers in the building. So the training is vital, which is why she's right, it can't be inconsistent, and it's why it's the underpinning of the government response today that we also ensure that the intelligence agencies and counter-terrorism are working hand in hand with our experts in prisons to get this right, and that we approach this with we approach these offenders with a degree of cynicism and scepticism as to their ability to refrain from the ideological conviction that clearly persists.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Leigh.
I agree with everything the Justice Secretary says about making these places safer. But I've been reading the report from the Prisons Inspectorate, which said that whilst separation centres were generally safe, there wasn't enough skilled focus on de-radicalisation. This is a highly complex area. Now, I don't want to sound like a sort of weak and washy liberal, but, you know, we do believe in the prisons are not just about punishment, they're also about redemption. So the Secretary of State may not be able to reply now, but I'd be interested if he could write to me in saying what skilled psychological pressures are we using on these people to try and change their behaviour. There are many good Muslims who totally abhor violence, who we could perhaps involve in this process. Maybe I'm being naive, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked.
Well, I recognise in the question the power of the Honourable Gentleman's Catholicism in redemptive capacity, and it's important that we have the best psychiatrists and those with the necessary psychosocial skills in this area working with this group of offenders. But I am convinced that we do have to remain cynical and cautious in relation to this particular group, recognising that you can present for years as effectively a passive, compliant prisoner and then down the line suddenly attack prison officers in the way that we saw.
I entirely agree with what the Justice Secretary has just said about the dangers of deception, and it's also concerning to note that people are now trying to use a mental health argument to get out of separation centres, given that anyone who holds a fanatical Islamist, Nazi or revolutionary view from some other doctrine, by definition has a mental health question mark over their personalities. But can he give an indication, and I appreciate he may have to write to me afterwards, can he give any indication about what proportion of people who have been imprisoned for terrorist offences related to Islamism are in separation centres and are in the rest of the prison estate, and what is known about the numbers of other people in the rest of the prison estate who have been radicalised by Islamist extremist prisoners within those parts of the prison estate that are not separated out like the units with which is primarily concerned today.
Justice Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to Right Honourable Gentleman. I'm happy to write to him with the detail because it's a very good question. With 254 prisoners in custody for terrorism related, and 60% of those having Islamic ideology, and all of the prisoners in our separation centres coming from that cohort, he will recognise that with a rising population of people in prison who present or say that they are of the Muslim faith, this is a tiny, tiny proportion, and it's important to emphasise that. However, radicalisation is a bigger thematic area than just the work of those extremists in separation centres. He's absolutely right. We've got to continue bearing down on it. And I've discussed this at committee stages of bills under the last government. It remains a long-standing issue and it will continue to be, I suspect, for decades to come.
Ben Obsijekti.
Thank Deputy Speaker, I wholeheartedly agree that our most dangerous prisoners should be dealt with appropriately. But I want to touch on an adjacent point around prison capacity. We're obviously aware that the government is in the process of rolling out more prison places, around 14,000, but we're also aware that none of those prison places are currently designated as Category A. Now, looking at the most recent statistics for the beginning of the year, of the available capacity within the prison system, only 12% of it is actually Category A. Is the Justice Secretary confident that there is enough remaining capacity in the prison system at Category A level, given that the remaining prison places planned are Category B to D? And what is the number of available prison places remaining that will trigger a need for us to build out that capacity?
Well, I was very pleased to say that in the orals just previously that we now are turning the tide on the prison capacity crisis that we inherited. Within the context of my statement, I talked about a tiered approach, yes, a supermax approach, but on more than one site. And by definition, as we enter a spending review, and I make that case, and the case that Jonathan Hall makes, by necessity, they will have to be Category A at the highest tier for this group of prisoners. It's important, as we saw, after the incident at Franklin, we were able to move prisoners to other high security sites. We've got Belmarsh here in London that I visited early in post. So he's absolutely right, we will need to have those places. I'm happy to write to him with more detail.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his statement and for his careful words. In Northern Ireland, we have operated segregation within our prison during the Troubles and found that it is essential to keep those who were able to turn moderates around into fanatics away from the general populace. However, for most of that time we didn't have to wrestle against the ECHR. In matters of national security, we have the right to restrict privileges such as privacy and right of assembly. So will the Minister not exercise these powers and to keep in isolation those whose very presence is dangerous?
Well, I recognise that the Honourable Gentleman has great experience in staring at the face and the consequences of terrorist and extremist behaviour. I think it's important that we remain within the ECHR framework, but it is also important that we bear down on excessive litigation, that the guidance is clear for the staff that have to work within this framework, and where we can, we look at capping, compensation payments, for example, and other areas. So we will continue to review how within staying within the law, we're not creating an excessive and unbearable environment for those who have to work and protect us all.
That is the end of the statement on separation centres review.